Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. That last presentation, Peter, is fantastic. I got pretty chilly watching the lava run. But anyway, my name is Amanda Podmore, Grand Canyon Director at the Trust. Want to give a nod of my hat to Roger Clark here today. Here today, very grateful to be celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day, week, year on the lands of the Southern Paiute and Pueblo people here in Kanab. I'd like to talk to you about some of the current dam threats we're seeing on the Little Colorado River and potential pathways in working with tribes to protect the Little Colorado, or LCR, in the long run. I imagine pretty much everyone in this room has had the lifetime experience of seeing the Little Colorado River and its confluence with the Colorado in Grand Canyon National Park. Whether you saw it in its beautiful milky turquoise blue color or that like thick chocolate milk flash flood stage, it's just a very impressionable place. And it's a place of deep cultural and ecological significance. Here's a little bit of a bird's eye view of the Little Colorado River coming into the Grand Canyon. It is quite a long drainage. It's a 300-mile tributary to the Grand Canyon that starts in the White Mountains. And as it weaves its way towards the Grand Canyon, it passes traditional and modern day lands of the White Mountain Apache, Zuni, Hopi, Navajo, and the last 55 miles of the LCR, which I'm going to be focusing on today, are on Navajo Nation land. I'm going to refer to that as the LCR, or the lower gorge, and this is the focus of the recent Escalade fight and the dams of today. I would be remiss in talking about the LCR with giving you a full picture of all the tribes that have stewarded this landscape for millennia. There are over 11 tribes that are associated with the Grand Canyon, and with the LCR in particular, there's at least 10 tribes that find deep cultural significance in this waterway. The LCR itself is, contains immeasurable cultural places. It includes the Hopi Salt Trail, the Hopi Place of Emergence, and so many other places that it's actually eligible as a traditional cultural property under the National Historic Preservation Act. And currently Navajo Nation is working, at the grassroots level up, folks in Navajo Nation are working to designate the lower LCR as a sacred site. So, threats. Certainly, the landscape of the Colorado Plateau has seen centuries of extractive threats that have, in a lot of ways, challenged local people and their livelihoods. There's a really strong history of extraction of the landscape, be it coal or water or uranium energy, that has not always benefited the local communities, particularly has not benefited the local indigenous communities, though they continue to be a very resilient people. But what has been a sort of, development delays or even development prohibitions in this area, which I'll get to later, have led to a real hunger and need for locally grounded economic development. And so we actually saw this come to play in 2012 with the Escalade tram. I'm sure this missed the attention of few. This was a huge stink in our community, in the rafting community. I'm sure a lot of you spoke out against this, and for which we are really grateful. The Escalade tram was a mega proposal that would have brought thousands of people a day potentially from the rim of the Grand Canyon to the confluence of the LCR and the Grand Canyon. But what's really important to note of in this proposal is that it was put forth by Navajo proponents, again, because of this need for local economic opportunities. There was a group of families in the area, the Save the Confluence families, who worked diligently from 2012 to 2017 to fight the Escalade proposal. And thanks to their help and the help of many folks in this room, people across the country really, there was enough pressure that Navajo Nation voted down the Escalade tram in 2017. And the families were really excited to move past this proposal and potentially look for opportunities for healing and for long-term protections for the LCR. But about 2 years into this healing process, they learned of a new threat to the LCR, which was 2 dam proposals on the LCR put forth by a Phoenix developer, Pumped Hydro Storage LLC. And this, the proposal for 2 dams, one was the Salt Trail Canyon Dam, one was the LCR Dam. They were just half a mile to 5 miles from the park boundary. They would have had severe impacts to the flow of the LCR, the population of the endangered humpback chub, and they could have potentially flooded cultural sites, not to mention the fact that they were on Navajo Nation land, and yet Navajo Nation was not fully consulted on this project. They did not give consent for these projects to be on their land. Then the next year, we learned that the developer was putting forth a 3rd proposal called the Big Canyon Storage Dam. And the Big Canyon Dam would be 3 separate storage facilities that wouldn't flood the LCR, but would actually, in what could be considered worse, pump 14 billion gallons of groundwater out of this very arid, dry landscape to fill these storage facilities for pumped hydro. And due to putting big storage facilities in the desert, you'd have to replace about 4 billion gallons of water every year that would be lost to evaporation. And this proposal came forth during COVID, during a time of a mega drought in this area when there were actually potable water restrictions put in place across Navajo Nation this summer, and yet here's an outside developer proposing to generate electricity without the consent of Navajo Nation, and it would be it's like 3,600 megawatts of electricity as the output that would benefit distant cities, not the local Navajo residents. So many Navajo community members, tribes, including Navajo Nation, Hopi, Wallapai, Department of Interior, many people objected to this proposal. Just this past summer, we learned that the developer was canceling or surrendering the first 2 permits, the the Salt Trail and the LCR, so that he could put basically all his eggs in one basket and really go forward with this Big Canyon Dam proposal. So where it stands now is that the Big Canyon Dam has not received its preliminary permit, so we're waiting for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to say yay or nay on its preliminary permit. Should it get that preliminary permit, that means that the developer has 3 years to do a feasibility study for these dams. That's when they might look at things like Endangered Species Act and location and water availability and things like that. After that feasibility study, they would then apply for a license, and should they get that, they would have a 50-year hydropower license on Navajo Nation land, despite Navajo Nation's objections. So, how do we get here to this place where we're talking about hydroelectric proposals on Navajo Nation lands that are really just geographically and realistically inappropriate? So I want to give a little bit of context first. I'll go into some historical context quite briefly, and then I want to talk about some of the federal regulations and laws that have put us here and some of the shortcomings that we need to overcome to truly protect the LCR. So for historical context, I really don't want to gloss over the fact that there have been 400 years of genocide against indigenous people in this landscape. But unfortunately, I don't have the time to really go into that right now. I also don't have a lot of time to go into federal Indian law. But 3 things that are really important to this geographic context are, first, the history of uranium mining in the region of the Grand Canyon and how that has devastated communities with high cancer rates to this day. Coal mining that has depleted aquifer and water sources, and the former Bennett freeze that was a development restriction on the landscape. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Bennett Freeze, I feel like it's really should be more well known. This was a development freeze put in place on 1.5 million acres of Navajo Nation lands that was put in place in order to push like a settlement of land disputes between Navajo and Hopi. And this development freeze that went in place in 1966 was not repealed until 2009. So for that amount of time, these Navajo communities were not allowed to build a new house. A lot of folks, interpret it to be you couldn't even like repair your house, fix a window if that broke. And so I think this is so important for understanding why, when it comes to Grand Canyon and the LCR, we need to look at preservation, but also at economic opportunities. Just want to note here, the Little Colorado River is actually the boundary between the Botaway Gap and Cameron chapters. So getting into how we got here with the federal regulatory and legal framework, I am a little bit of a policy wonk. I hope to not bore you to death. But really, we're here because our federal laws only recognize the right to tribal consultation. And tribal consultation is merely procedural. It's saying, hey, did you talk to the tribes? Okay, great, let's continue. It's not substantive, and that's because we don't recognize in the United States the right to free, prior, and informed consent, which is an international right recognized by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that says, hey, when we're dealing with your traditional territories, you have the right to freely give your revocable consent on a project. Instead, what we have here is we have the Federal Power Act, which oversees all the laws around licensing of dams, which are overseen by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. And Federal Power Act gives private developers the right to develop a dam on public lands, on tribal lands, even if the tribes that hold those lands or the tribes that have connections to those lands don't agree with that project. This just shows you that as a developer goes through all the different steps of getting that 50-year hydropower license, it's only after they've gotten the preliminary permit, done the feasibility study, filed a pre-license application, that they then start consultation with tribes. So it's really not happening early on enough. And I think it's important to understand the regulatory framework so that we're not just saying the developer is at fault. I think the developer could have done better in this instance in getting more of a social license to operate and working with tribes earlier on. But this is what he was working with. So, he checked those boxes as was required. Really what this led to was, as I mentioned, shortcomings in consent. Consultation was not meaningful, and ultimately this led to an undermining of tribal sovereignty because the LCR, when it runs through that gorge and through those into the confluence with the Grand Canyon, it actually runs through a Navajo Nation tribal park and a Navajo Nation biological preserve that was put in place to protect the humpback chub. And by putting a dam in this tributary and basically saying an outside developer can decide what happens on these sovereign lands of Navajo Nation, we're undermining all the management paradigms they have put in place to date. So I'm here on behalf of Grand Canyon Trust. I want to talk about what we're doing, how we've been working with community members on this issue. The trust started an initiative with American Rivers, with some community members from the LCR, and we said, hey, ideally, what would you like to see happen in the LCR watershed and this lower LCR? And here's what we heard from them. They do want durable or permanent conservation for the area that allows them to continue their traditional land uses like sheep herding, but that also includes their voices and their consent, and that also leaves the door open for economic development. We don't want to fully foreclose the right to development opportunities. So are doing this ongoing assessment, and we've identified a couple different pathways that the tribes and supporters could pursue to help the LCR. The first one is supporting existing tribal authorities. As I mentioned, there's a Navajo Nation tribal park on the lower LCR. There's a biological preserve. It'd be really cool if we did what we could to support the planning and management of those, which would ultimately be affirming tribal sovereignty. But as I've said, that's not enough to actually stop a dam. I really think some sort of federal legislative solution is needed, and there's a couple different ways that could look. The first, we could actually look at amending the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, because the LCR certainly qualifies as a wild and scenic river. However, the way that the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is currently written, tribes cannot designate their own tribal waterways as wild and scenic. So the Grand Canyon Trust is working with some fine folks at the Getch's Wilkinson Center at the University of Colorado Law School to actually suggest amended language to the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Another legislative option is amending the Federal Power Act. This is not one that I would necessarily recommend because that'd be a huge lift, but you know, it's out there. Another legislative option would be creating a unique protective area for the LCR and the confluence that could foster collaborative management. You could look at something like a cultural heritage area that was proposed in Montana. You could get creative with Congress and the local community members and tribes. Third option that is on the table is reforming the actual FERC rules. So changing the Code of Federal Regulations as to how FERC does its licensing, its preliminary permits, so that you're including consultation, meaningful consultation, and potentially even consent at those early stages of a dam proposal. And the reason it would be so helpful to have those earlier on is that think about, like, we've seen during COVID how tribes are really challenged in their capacity right now, and they've had to expend a lot of resources on fighting things like these. If early on they can either give their consent, yes or no, or yes with these conditions, that would waste a lot less time for the developer, for FERC, for these tribal communities. There's so many reasons to reform these. In conclusion, I really think that no matter what tribes want to do for this landscape, there's going to need to be a layering of these different tools in our ultimate strategy, because no one tool is perfect on its own. For example, I don't think you could just do federal legislation, because that might be perceived as just like a colonial, kind of overreach on tribal lands. In the same way, you couldn't just support Navajo Nation in their sacred site designation process, because as we see, that doesn't ultimately stop a dam, and that doesn't provide outside funding. I forgot to mention Wild and Scenic Rivers does provide funding, so that'd be great. I'm here speaking on behalf of the Grand Canyon Trust. I don't represent the tribes, and it's ultimately the tribes and Native communities that need to weigh in on these ideas and let us know, hey, we'd like to do X, Y, or Z, and we want your help, or hey, we don't want your help. So I really think that's paramount to the conversation here today and going forward. And third, I'm hopeful that if we do go down this roadway, some of these changes could have really far-reaching impacts for landscapes across the West, across the United States. For example, if we were to amend the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act so that tribes could designate their own waterways, that could impact, I believe it's up to over 60 tribes and over 90 waterways could then be eligible for wild and scenic rivers and the associated funding. Same with, FERC regulatory reform would help on energy projects across the country. So with that, I thank you so much for your time and attention. I don't want to stand anymore between you and lunch, so thank you, and I hope to chat with some of you offline.